Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion session. My name is Sophie Hunter. I work for lots of different people actually. I'm a freelancer, but in this particular role I'm working for IVE, which is the Arts Council Bridge organisation for Yorkshire and the Humber. And that means that we connect with arts organisations and help them connect with children and young people. So the reason why I'm here is because probably about 2 years ago, Kenny and Parky came on a course with me, something that I run quite often, which is over a 6-month period, and they've asked me to do it in an hour. Okay? But over a 6-month period, organisations come and spend some time with me to think about diversity and inclusion and to think about what they could do to begin making change. So I want to whiz you through a process, and by the end of it, our aim is to fill in those 2 pieces of paper at the end, the one with pink and green Post-its. You've got pink and green Post-its with you. So as I talk and as you talk, if you come up with ideas of things that brass bands in England could do to promote diversity and inclusion, or you think about things that you could do individually or you within your band could do, then by the end of the session we're going to ask you to write those things down, and if you want to put your name on them and say this is what I'm saying I will do, great. If not, they can be anonymous, but suggestions. So what I've been asked to do in this session in our speedy hour is to gather some suggestions. But to start off with, I wanted to talk about, and this is really speedy, I wanted to start off with something called unconscious bias, which is something that everybody has, and is the reason why we end up in a situation where our worlds are silos. In fact, I'm going to close it up, start off. So the way that human beings were developed millions of years ago is that we were created to keep ourselves safe and to keep ourselves alive. And in order to do that, we had to make sure at that time that we weren't going to get eaten by a wild animal. So we were continuously tracking for danger and tracking for information. Hi there. Sorry. There's one chair left. And we haven't evolved as human beings. We have clearly evolved since that point, but we still process information very fast. So the way that we kept our ancestors kept themselves safe was by processing information very fast. So, no, different page. So the way that we think about unconscious bias is just to acknowledge that everybody has differences. Okay? So this is background that I need to be able to refer to, so I'm going to whiz you through. Where everybody has differences, like all your bands are different, all our families are different, everyone is individual, and we have to acknowledge those differences. We have to be able to refer to them, and also an acknowledgement that we're all biased. And we all have biases, and we all have different biases. So in the brass band world, you may have different biases to the footballing world, or you may have different biases to one of my children collects match cards, and we all have different biases. And one of my children who collects match cards wouldn't be interested, really, in what goes on in the brass band world. So we all have different biases, we all have different interests, and we have to acknowledge those biases and work around stopping them impacting on what we do. So I will come back to that. I don't know if my very low-tech glue tacking world is actually going to work. No, it's not. So the unconscious bias has a purpose, and the purpose goes back to that wild animal chasing thing. So at the moment, the way that the world is going at the moment, the way we're asked to live in this world is we're processing 11 million pieces of data at any point. and we can only cope with 40 pieces of data at any point. And so we have to keep blocking things out. So that's the point at which we categorise things. That's the point at which we decide, I'm not interested in this, I'm interested in that. That is something to do with me, it's not something to do with me. And the way that we need, in order to make change, when we're in a world which is quite comfortable and is the place that we're really, really used to, we will keep processing those 40 pieces of information and we won't think about the 11 million ones around us. Because we can't survive otherwise as human beings. You cannot survive, you can't process 11 million pieces of information at the same time. So in order to make changes, in order to change who's in the brass band world in this conversation, we need to begin to clock what are our biases. What are the things that we hold on to that we think is really important in brass banding world? What are the things that could change? What's scary about change? What is threatening about change? Or what is exciting or possible about change? Are you with me? Okay, I said it was going to be fast. So the reasons why we need to clock is that we end up, if we don't notice that we have unconscious bias, then we end up favouring our own groups. So when somebody, I don't know, you might only talk to people who you think would be interested in brass bands. And actually Edward just gave us some interesting examples when he described the band that he was helping last week, and he was saying, it was somebody who was who worked in a hospital, and somebody who worked in a supermarket, and somebody who was a bus driver, and that actually what I'm hearing is that brass bands accept lots and lots and lots of different people. So acknowledging that our own unconscious bias, the things that the places where we feel comfortable mean that we favour our own group. We often work with stereotypes, so we believe that one type of person wouldn't be interested or would be interested in brass bands. We can be prejudiced, and we can be very egocentric and very insular. So it's the ways in which we protect ourselves. So it's completely normal and natural, and everyone does it. But in order to make change, you have to notice that it's there. Okay. So that's the theory bit. We can lose the theory bit now. I don't know quite how successful this was as a plan. I thought I was going to be in a really tiny room from the way that it was described, so I thought, we don't need a PowerPoint. Okay. So that's my first question. Who's in the room? So look around, and who is in the room? So as you look around, if you saw each other in the street, would you imagine that you were all interested in brass banding? Is there anything in particular that tells you that you're all interested in brass banding? No. Okay. So we go, woo! So who isn't in the room? In fact, hands up if you are over 60. Okay? Hands up if you're over 50. Hands up if you're over 40. Hands up if you're over 30. Hands up if hands up if you're over 20. Great. Okay. Did anyone not have their hands up? No. So that's a huge range. So there's really good age range. Okay, there are marginally more men than there are women in the room, but there is also gender diversity that I can see visually. Okay. There are different. As far as I can see, everybody is white in the room. Okay, so that's who's not in the room. So one of the things that we will begin addressing is who isn't in the room. What's the difference between the people who are already involved in brass bands and the opportunities around who could be involved in brass bands? So I've actually covered that one. So, has anyone heard of this term, protected characteristics. So protected characteristics, this is legally what we are meant to be doing. Okay? We are meant to be making sure that anything that exists, particularly anything that's publicly funded, should be open and available to all protected characteristics. And it is illegal to discriminate against any of these protected characteristics. So if you discriminate against somebody because of their age, that's illegal. If you discriminate against somebody because they have disability, that's illegal. Discriminating against somebody who's had gender reassignment, discriminating, so marriage and civil partnership, that kind of sounds a bit funny, but the discrimination would be that you are prejudiced towards someone who is married, or you're suspicious of somebody who has a civil partnership, or that's where the discrimination happens there. Pregnancy and maternity. So if somebody, I don't know how it works in the Browse family world, but there are many stories of women who have been pregnant and who've been bypassed for jobs, or whose job hadn't been there and they've come back. That's illegal. Okay. So, but equally, I've heard stories. I've heard two stories recently where somebody, because they were around, they recently married and could potentially become pregnant, within a recruitment situation, there was a kind of, oh yeah, but they'll come, they'll arrive, and then they'll go off and they'll get pregnant. And that's illegal. You're not allowed to discriminate against somebody because they are pregnant, might be pregnant, or are off on maternity leave. Race. So discriminating against somebody because of their race, discriminating against somebody because of their religion and belief, discriminating against somebody because of their sex, because of their sexual orientation, and then there's another one that actually it's not legal, but there is also a sense that discriminating against people because of their socio-economic status, because of where they live, because of whether they're rich or poor, that those are things that also need clocking. So, I would like you to do a little bit of chatting. So thinking about, currently, if you think about is anyone from the same background out of interest? No, great. So in pairs, or you could turn around and speak to someone behind you, but just very quickly think about any examples where you feel that either you know of an example within brass bands, or you know an example within your own brass bands, or brass bands, a bigger version of I'm going to put those protected characteristics back in, of the protected characteristics, and where maybe what's the makeup of the banding world now? That's an easier question, I think. So where do you sit within those? Do you think, so we just worked out there's a really broad age range, for example. Okay? What about disability? Have a chat about disability. Is disability something that is straightforward within the banding world? Gender reassignment. Just have a little look, maybe choose two, and have a chat for a couple of minutes with your neighbour around the makeup of the banding world in relation to one of those protected characteristics. Does that make sense?
Okay, so bringing that conversation to
Great. Does anyone fancy sharing a little bit about what we discussed? Yeah.
That'd be interesting. So I was having a conversation with my neighbour here, Richard. The areas that we looked at was disability, and also I'd be interested in discussing the areas of pregnancy and maternity. So I think one of the areas that I think is quite interesting is where you've got things like learning disability. And I won't mind saying that I've actually got first-hand experience of this.
Okay.
And I've done a lot of research into it as well, where learning disabilities can result in mental health problems, depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. Now, an area of banding where we need to perhaps need to focus, traditional banding. You commit 110%, you turn up to band all the time, you play the right notes, you play them with the right style. If you don't, you can expect the conductor and other players around the band to be eyeballing you.
Okay.
Or having some strong words with you. If you're one of these people who perhaps is slower to pick up things but you're trying really hard, or perhaps you're more prone to things such as anxiety, performance anxiety, etc., and you're getting treated like that now, I think there's a possibility that bands could be failing to be as diverse as they need to be in the disability field.
Great, good point. So some kind of support required for performance anxiety support, which could be for anybody, but you're talking about it particularly within learning disability.
Yes,
Yes.
that's one example.
Also
That really
with
springs to mind.
physical disability. When I used to be a decent player all the time, and I was thinking of perhaps going to a local band, but you can't do that because you can't match. So I'm sort of excluded myself. And it's just one of those things that sometimes, with the best one in the world,
Yeah.
you just can't do things.
And there's no wheelchair accessible march.
Well, you can't really go around matching.
We did talk
We
about
have not.
this because obviously, you know, I mean, we have players in our band that are not, you know, through age as much as anything, who don't march, but we always make adjustment in terms of the fact that if there's a performance at the other end of the match, we talk about with pride, they'll play on that, and you make reasonable adjustments. So we march with less players, and I think, you know, Jordan, if you're more than welcome to come and play at Worth if you want. But we've got an issue if we rehearse upstairs, you know, and so that's where the wheelchair stuff and things like that. So there's lots of you know examples like that. But it's about the organisation, and in this case bands, making reasonable adjustments. And I would say that if somebody wants to be in the band, and you know, we've got people who don't do the marches, don't march with the band because they can't.
And for me, this is a really good example of such a really simple unconscious bias. It's like if the person who's booking the room is able-bodied and doesn't have a problem walking up with stairs, unless they're clocking that bias, they will book a room up the stairs. All the bands always mess upstairs or whatever.
It's where the band's rehearsed for 150 years. So
it does stop people. It stops a band being completely open access. It just from a staircase. So it's a very simple example of the fact that if you changed where the band was meeting, something could shift. Can I have any other examples? So we've got a learning disability, we've got physical disability. Yeah.
Say about I know a lot of band jobs will be in churches and a lot of band playing hymns and stuff, which is quite prohibitive to somebody different religions in particular.
Yeah. And is there any solution to that?
I suppose other than not playing those jobs, for certain people it might not matter, they might be able to still go and stuff, but it could be that you wouldn't play those.
It does put some people off, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does.
Great, thank you.
Can I go on to age?
Say that
Can I
again.
go on to age?
You can go
It's either age or a bias against certain things, like self-protection. What I'm getting at is that I used to teach, but I used to teach at the RNCM in Hilly, and I've been around a few bands and I've had quite a lot of experience teaching. And when I sort of retired, because I couldn't stand up anymore for very long and things like that, I called it a draw. Then I've been teaching for 40 odd years in various like Leeds, London, Preston, London College of Music, all this stuff. And the bottom line is that when I emigrated to Spain for a while, I started an outfit out there, and then it became too bad and I had to come back. So I came back and I thought, well, maybe I could be of use to one or two of the local bands who've got young conductors. And I offered the services. I said, look, I don't want to take a band, I can't do it. I just can't do it. But what I've got is a lot of knowledge, and I'd like to pass it on. So if you need any help with, you know, the conductor's away for rehearsal, I can take it, you know, the conductor that does it all and all sorts. And I said, I'll step in. Don't want any money for it. Just give me a ring, because I'm doing nothing. I'll pop around and take rehearsal for a while he's off.
Yeah.
there was one band, very local, a band called Billy, I won't mind naming it, and the conductor died, so they didn't have one. They were going through a process, and I said, look, while you've got no conductor, if you want, I'll take the rehearsals for you until you get one, or until you get auditions or whatever. I don't want any money for it. No thanks, we're all right. And I'm thinking, why? And then Blackpool Brass had a guy, and he was only sort of 19 or something, and he would having to go overseas. And I had a lot of experience, and I said, if you want, can I put up a project man that's been listen? And I listened, and I looked at him, and he was all over the place, and a little flat, I could have put it right. And I said, look, you knew Eddie, if you want, I'll come up and help you sort yourself out, you know. And they just, and I had a fear, in my own mind, that they were afraid I wanted to take over.
Yeah.
No, you know why that is?
I just wondered.
That's pride. Because they don't want to have it taken off them. They might be learning, but they're hoping, and I suppose in one way of practicing, that they are going to get it right. And they don't want it taken off him. But as far as the advice goes, it's wrong, you should take the advice.
What,
I went to
we're quite short of time, I'm really sorry, I don't want to stop you at all. What I'd love you to do is clock that it's one of the things that is a suggestion I think you can make to Prosperous England around mentoring, around advice, around masterclasses, around, you know, that
I'll
sense
just
of,
close, the army turned up to go back.
yeah,
And it turned out it was under the King's Division. I taught the director of music as a student, and they asked me to do one for the last 6 years. I've been teaching players and mentoring them. So they wanted a local bands go.
great. Well, I'm really glad that someone is getting your knowledge, and there is ageism in this society. It goes against young people and against older people as well, and it's just a really good thing to clock. Yes.
Yeah, we were talking about race because it's very easy. It's easy to see how white bands are,
Yeah.
and then colour is not necessarily that we're all like from the same place, but you don't see that many coloured people in bands, and we were saying like location, where your band is an issue because you recruit locally, and like our band is ridiculously the opposite because we're based right in the middle of a city, which is, and when we say diverse, it's ridiculous. We've got everything to. If you wanted to tick boxes, we'd tick boxes basically.
But that's fantastic that you're drawing from your local community.
It's because of where we are, and I wonder if location is a barrier.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a barrier because you're serving your local community, so your community. I mean, a lot of the band that I play for, we're in a village in Lancashire, which is predominantly white.
Yeah. But in the same sense as like if you practice upstairs, that's an unconscious barrier to people who are. Location is an issue, to diversity.
Yeah. Well, and in lots of different ways actually. Location, not just racial diversity, but I think because it also linked to physical
The
disability.
band I'm involved with, Anne Richards' band, are at either side of Rochdale, and Rochdale is a very diverse community, but we don't tend to get. Well, I'm in a little village similar to Richard, and predominantly white village. And I was just saying, we don't seem to get, from like 3 miles away, we don't get diverse players.
But all that starts at school, surely. Cultural, exactly. If a young person wants to start playing, regardless of colour or religion, it starts at school. It doesn't start when they're 30 or 40, because they don't want to go to a band then. They want to start.
It doesn't have to start at school. It can start in bands.
As a child, though, Richard. As a child.
No, but if bands get involved, no, it starts at that age, and because of what used to be called wider opportunities, all the children in schools supposedly get experience. I know it's not always brass and do other things, but they all get that experience, and so it should be that these youngsters are coming through from right across.
And I think one of the issues is that they're getting wider opportunity music, but for a very short period of time,
Exactly.
and then it's not necessarily being picked
and that's
up.
where bands can fit in.
Yeah.
And we've got
it's a really good potential link.
We are people have a perception of bands in Northern Ireland and who are in the bands, but that may not necessarily reflect how we feel as a whole as a community. We want as many people as possible. We want people to be coming and joining all our local bands,
Yeah.
but we're fighting against a perception of us. So for us, we want to try and change that and show that we are inclusive and we will welcome anybody, no matter who they are or where they're from, that can come and they can play music, because that's what we're there for. We're all here today because of the music, and that's what we need to try and change the outside world's perception of us and make it us all the world.
And it's not just us that have unconscious bias, everyone does. So there is that thing that you're battling against, which is that somehow people will have a view of, oh, brass bands aren't for me. So that finding ways to fight that is great. I'm really aware that there's some questions on the back row, and you've asked one, so I will come back to you. Yes.
Well, I think it goes down to the actual culture of where they come from, as in terms of religion, for example. And I looked into, because I was doing the wider ups in school, and I did it for about 10 years. And if, for example, there was some who would not participate because they came from for example, in Islam, for example, that if you're given a strict doctrine saying you cannot play wind instruments, because it's part that the imam might say you must not participate in that. And I've come across that where I've had to use drums or other types of instruments, and it can even be as strict as saying no to drums, only vocal. So there are cultural things. There's, for example, Jehovah's Witness and other people who don't celebrate anything whatsoever, and you're doing a whole wider ops to a whole class of children. Mums come in, you can't participate in the Christmas event because we don't celebrate Christmas.
That's people self-excluding though, isn't it?
So it's self-excluding.
Yeah, you can't, that's very extreme.
There's two perspectives.
And I think all we can do is plot how open we're being, how wide is the door, where are we broadcasting, what are we saying.
I think it's really important not to start saying, oh, Muslims aren't allowed to do music, so we may as well not bother trying. And I think that happens.
Well, and it's very specific to the imam in my experience.
It's down to the imam of the local area.
Yeah. You had your hand up at one point. Is it up or down?
I was just the point you just made about bands being insular. Professor Gregson touched on it as well. I think that's one of the major things that we don't let the outside world know about these things. We think that the outside world knows, but they don't. I can assure you that they don't. And that's one of the hurdles that I think we need to get over, which would help enormously with all these issues.
Yeah.
Well, if I make a suggestion on that, I'm going into the local library next week to give a talk on brass bands.
Great.
For whoever.
Great.
And it's from that's Thornton Library. Just do a session on a Friday morning, just to anybody who wants to.
And from my point of view, I've worked with Parky and Kenny for 6 months, and I learnt so much about brass bands. And what I realised is, I'd heard them play at local events, but for me it was something that was really exclusive. It was related. I believed that they were related to church. I did believe that it was only for white men. What I realised as I worked with them was how many biases I had towards brass bands. It was just an area that I knew almost nothing about. So that maybe Brass Bands England can do a huge campaign around brass bands rather than brass bands are only for the small section of the population. They are for everyone. Yes.
You just made the point then about you thought brass bands were for white men. It's quite interesting, and it touched on something that Edward Gregson said in the speech. I'm lucky. I play for a four-section band in Blakely, Greater Manchester, who are very sort of forward-looking, and in terms of all these sort of gender diversity criteria, if you like, they tick a lot of the boxes.
Great.
Unfortunately, I have seen examples of bands that still are very backward-looking bands and conductors who've still got attitudes that date back to the 1970s and beyond, and they fail to certainly meet some of these. I'll give you a prime example of it. There's a certain conductor who came out on Facebook and made a comment about everybody should be at band 110% of the time, 100% of the time. The only exception for missing rehearsal is death, basically. That upset quite a lot of some of his members who had maternity, paternity commitments, work commitments that are outside of your 9 to 5, you fall into the socio-economic class. Unfortunately, that still happens. And a suggestion around it is what Edward Gregson said about bands, particularly in contesting, subscribing to an organisation like Brass Bands England and being trained on and adhering to a set of guidelines where you've got to meet all of these.
Great. Top idea, and make sure it goes on to green. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through because I think we could probably stay just there. So, in the areas that we don't connect with lie solutions to potential problems. So, clearly one of the reasons for engaging with a wider group of people is that brass bands then keep growing and don't shrink and become obsolete, but they become this bigger force. There's so much potential. Just on a really basic level, if you are looking for funding, particularly national funding, and you're looking for funding that might connect to an organisation like the Arts Council, you will be asked and expected to adhere to those guidelines. You will be asked and expected to work across the board and for your band to be as broadly focused as possible. That's one of the things that comes when you're receiving money from elsewhere. And I think I made the point that there was a legal responsibility.
Could I just
Yes.
Well, I'm intrigued to think that bands are out there that are actually deliberately having a bias against any of those protected characteristics. I can't believe that there are bands which say we don't want any black people or we don't want any gay people. I just don't believe that.
And I'm sure you're right.
The whole, if you take my band for instance, it is open completely.
Yeah.
And I don't see there might be instances from a conductor's point of view or an individual to an individual that might be debatable as whether or not that person should have said that or acted in that way. But as a band, and the banding world is open to everybody.
Great.
I really can't see that it isn't open to everybody.
I think but I think the point is that's your perception from within. What's the perception of the people of race, of different race and different gender and different, from outside?
So
I think what you're saying there is just, we're talking about what the banding world is, and that's what it is.
And I think what's really important is that each band knows that the door is open. Each band is conscious that they're not rehearsing in a room that's up a flight of stairs and stopping somebody who's disabled from participating. Or
But
each band has
pick up
thought
on
through.
that. That band probably can't do anything other than be up there. You can't just suddenly say, oh well, we'll move to a premises. You've got to have funding to do that. There's an obstacle in the way there that isn't the band's fault.
But it's worth at least clocking the obstacle and wondering whether there's a reason.
Sure.
We've
just
else.
had a new band room and we've just done something there. And so when we did that, we made sure it was wheelchair accessible, for instance. Right? But to take that band that is upstairs and criticise them.
No, I mean, it wasn't taken as criticism. I think what we would do is we would make necessary adjustments if required, if at some point somebody who needed that access.
I'm sure you would.
That's right. Came and said we want to be in the band.
And that's all this is about, is really just clocking where might we be holding a bias that is unconscious. I'm not in any way saying people are actively discriminating. What I'm noticing is that the world of brass bands doesn't necessarily reflect the broad diversity of Britain.
I disagree.
Do you?
Yeah, my band, as I say, could check every one of those and say, we've got age situations, we've got disability situations, we've had a young girl that became a man. All of those has happened in our band. We have not discriminated anywhere in that. So I say to you that if my band is typical, right, then I would relate it to the rest of the banding world. If the rest of the banding world, and if these people have, I don't think you've actually said that your bands are actually discriminating against anybody in those situations. You might have instances, as I say, person to person or something like that. But can you tell me that you've got, bands which would turn around and say, we don't want any black people, we don't want any Roman Catholics?
It's a question of what you see in a band. It's a question about subceptions. It's what you, when you go to, if I was to go to a group, I would want to see something that looked like me, probably, to feel comfortable in that group.
Right.
And I think that, and I think it's changing that, like what the bands look like to people outside coming in. Not what, bands not excluding anyone. We want everyone to, we want every person in the street to play an instrument, definitely, for sure.
Yeah.
But how can we make that clear to everyone in our society?
Great
And that's,
example, just
thank
from our-
you, because for me, that's the purpose of this session, is not to say, not to kind of, I'm not standing here, I'm sorry if that's how it comes across, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but the change doesn't happen unless people genuinely have clocked that the door is open. And so, when you see a band playing in the street and everybody looks like somebody who isn't you,
Yeah, they just assume.
they assume, and so that if you're in the culture, if you're in the band room, then that's one thing, but potentially we're also talking about people who are audiences or young people who might want to come up through the system.
Can I just to follow up what you said, I think when you say about your band being able to tick all the boxes, I think we've got commonality there. Mine is like that as well. I do a lot of decking around other bands, here in Yorkshire and other parts, and what I actually see is I see really good examples of bands which my band can do well to learn from, and I feed them back in. I also see examples of how not to behave, how bands fundamentally fail to meet this, their obligations in terms of diversity and inclusion. The problem is, the example that I can think of, a band, I've seen bands that have fundamentally failed, and like I say, your band, my band are not two of those. They fundamentally fail in their obligations, like, the way it can work at the moment, these may not be subscribed to Brass Bands England. They, as a result of their malpractice, shall we call it, they lose players. They can go, somehow, they manage to fudge things, if you like, ahead of their contest. You know, Professor Gregson talked about the contesting obsession, if you like, and our contesting bubble. It means a lot to them, it means a lot to banders who are involved in contesting. They can go into contests and somehow, despite their failures in what I've described, they can go onto that contest stage and they can pull something off and they can get a good result and they can actually make themselves look like a beacon through their contesting success, despite what's going on to the interior.
So I'm saying the world's behind you as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm also seeing examples where there are young people involved in these bands who are sort of almost, brainwashed is a strong word, but let's just stick with it. We'll use the word brainwashed into thinking that is the way to do things, that is the attitude to take. It fails in a lot of those. They then come out of that and that's the attitude they've got.
Yeah.
It's not good. That, unfortunately, like I said, it's not in the case in your band, it's not the case in mine, it is the case in some bands I've seen. And, like I say, the way around that is to almost adapt. Professor Gregson talked about the Norway model. If you don't subscribe to the big, their equivalent of Brass Bands England, you don't compete.
Yeah, it's a change in culture, isn't it,
yeah.
around quality.
You subscribe to Brass Bands
Yeah.
England, you've got to adhere to these, you've got to take on training, you've got to learn best practices, you've got to know how to meet criteria with diversity and inclusion, and there's better banding as a result of bands that go into contests to make success of themselves have to adhere to these principles.
The army have just tried to stop, or they're going against racialism because they've engaged a guy joined them, a college soprano player, Ashley Martin. The first thing they did when he got into the King's band, a recruitment posted. He's there, he's the only coloured guy in the King's Division band, and he's featured as a recruitment poster. And he's a smart lad, he's a good player, but it's now showing the people outside, without saying anything,
Yeah.
that we do accept coloured people and they're welcome.
Or another example, is it not time that the band took responsibility for letting, I can explain this, the band that I was connected with, the youth band, they used to have a small group go around to the schools let the kids have a go, you've done that, I know. Now, why don't that same group go into Bolton, where I know there's schools with a majority of Asians? Do they ever go into those schools?
Yeah. So it's
And
asking
say,
those
would
questions.
you like to have a
Yeah.
go? You know what I mean? Because then they're showing them that you are welcome.
And you can also work with the local music hub, which goes into every single
Yeah.
school, and make sure that every school is getting something.
Yeah.
We're motoring towards lunch, and I want you to. We need to fill those 2 sheets. So I just want to say one thing around the thing that you are going to write on your thing. The thing that you're going to write on your thing. The comment or the suggestion you're going to write on your Post-it notes. So I want you to. In our lives, a lot of what maybe we're concerned about or worried about can take up a lot of our energy. So I don't know. My traffic from where I live in Derbyshire here today was incredibly bad, and I was 40 minutes later than I wanted to be. And it took up a lot of my mental energy, but I could do absolutely nothing to stop it. So that's energy wasted, if you like. When we live much more efficiently, we're living thinking about the things that we can influence. So I have no control over traffic. I've got no control over Brexit, but I've got control over, to a certain extent, my teenage children. Control over the people that I work with. So the encouragement at this point, while you're thinking about what you're writing, is that you think about what's within your circle of influence. So and what's within the circle of influence of Brass Bands England. So so the pink Post-it note is what you or your band could do that would begin to think about some of the ideas from this room, some of the ideas from the keynote speech, things that you could adopt that would begin to change the face of maybe tiny things. There might be big things, there might be policy decisions, they could be attitudinal, and then also thinking about what within Brass Band England's circle of influence. So it's not changing the world, but it's kind of consciously thinking about them as a sector support organisation. What could they do? So I'm encouraging you with your ideas to be focused on this area rather than the bigger circle of concern. So this is the question: what can we do? Brass Bands England is very keen to know what you could do, what you might do as an individual or for your band, or to recommend, or what you are currently doing. Because your band, it sounds like, lots of you are already doing some fantastic stuff. So what they are very keen to do is to be able to write this up and publicise it, to give ideas to other bands. So being very conscious of the fact that there were some really great examples, and that's one of the ways in which I suppose the culture can learn. That's one of the reasons for being part of something like Brass Bands England, isn't it? Is that you can all learn from each other. So 5 minutes to write, and then we're going to share them. If you haven't got pens, there are pens on the table. You should all have Post-it notes, but shout if you need more. Pink is you or your band. Green is Brass Bands England.
No, I haven't actually. Not sat on that.
Do you want more? There's some.
Okay. So I'm from the Arts Council, so this is something we can do, not my band. I don't play in a band. So I think there's more we can probably do to support Brass Bands England, to promote the wide range of things that brass bands is and banding is, all that stuff we talked about today, and making sure people understand it's not just one thing, and we can really help get that message across. And then in terms of things Brass Band England could do, I had a few. I thought something would be to maybe look at good sort of diversity practice in other sectors or other parts of the music industry, so voluntary orchestras, choirs, that kind of thing, and see if there's any good practice that can be shared with the banding community.
Great.
So I just stick my other ones on.
Yes, thank you very much.
Talk about them.
And we'll make sure that they
okay.
They all get there. Thank you very much. You don't have to come up if you don't want to, you can give me the Post-its.
So I've got for Brass Bands England, try and encourage individuals to come together similar to this and kind of discuss the good practice and bad experiences and things like that.
Great.
What we do. And for bands individually, kind of think about attitudes within the band and how that might put people off with different groups.
Great. Thank you very much. And do feel free to put your other ones up, maybe after. Great. She's got a clutch.
I've screwed them all up. I thought we were only allowed one. I've got for Brass Bands England to have a youth youth. I'm really keen on the Scouts and Guides thing where you've got badges and all that, and that keeps people going. So it'd be nice to have that for young brass band players that celebrates all the aspects of brass. And then the other thing is one thing that we are doing, which is organising joint brass band events in the city to get bands into the city, talking to each other, but also reaching new audiences in the city.
Great, thank you.
For Brass Bands England, I've put make sure that brass bands are seen to be inclusive to all, promote brass banding in areas where it is lacking at the moment. And for my band personally, I've put continue to accept a varied age range within our band. We have players from 12 to 72 and try to include more diversity of colour, especially to reflect the local area.
Great. Fab, thank you. Okay.
Right, for our local band, I've put develop our academy. We have a band academy we go out and do in the local community. We go out and do wider ops at the music service where we are dozen, and then we've got the follow on so the kids can come and learn to play. And I think we need to perhaps expand that as much as we can. And it's about, I think it's a really great model, and it's perhaps part of what Brass Band England should do is to find these models of excellence. We've heard lots of examples and share them.
Yeah.
But that's the local band. I've got lots of Brass Band England. One of the first one is take examples of good practice and share them. So I've said that already. Sorry, I'm going to give you the others because they're real pearls of wisdom. Engage fully with music education hubs. There is good work out there. I did challenge Professor Greggs, and he did clarify that he was talking about funding for music education, but he actually said music education is a disgrace, and I'm really, it's not. And he clarified it to me because it was the funding for music education. There's some excellent work going on out there, and I think people sitting in conferences like this saying it's not happening in the schools need to open their eyes and go and have a look, because it does happen in a lot of schools. Build on the Unibrass model. I think that link between schools and adult bands is vital. So, and I think that the diversity of the student population could engage much more through Unibrass and through that. So I think that's a great one. And last one is I wrote when you mentioned yours. There is already talking about the awards and things like that. Arts Award. Arts Council, I think perhaps Brass Band England could talk with bands about how they can be involved in Arts Award, because that's a great opportunity for kids.